Corporal Hans Bauer had prepared himself for torture, starvation, and sleeping on cold concrete floors like an animal in a cage. What he found instead would shake everything he believed about his enemies and change his understanding of what true strength really meant. The clean bed waiting for him in that Wisconsin prison camp would become more than just a place to rest. It would become a symbol that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But how could something so simple transform a hardened Nazi soldier's entire worldview? And what did this act of unexpected kindness reveal about the real battle being fought? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The cattle car lurched violently as it rounded another bend, throwing Hans Bauer against the wooden wall with bone-jarring force. The metallic taste of blood filled his mouth where he had bitten his tongue, but he barely noticed anymore. After 3 days of this hellish journey, pain had become as constant as breathing. Around him, 47 other German prisoners of war swayed like broken marionettes, their uniforms torn and stained with sweat, mud, and worse things that Hans tried not to think about. The air inside the car was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and human waste. Someone in the corner had been sick hours ago, and the acidic smell mixed with the metallic odor of dried blood from various wounds sustained during their capture. Hans pressed his back against the rough wooden planks and tried to ignore the burning sensation in his empty stomach. They'd been given nothing but stale bread and murky water once a day, barely enough to keep a man conscious, let alone strong. "Where do you think they're taking us?" whispered Klaus Richter, a young private from Bavaria whose baby face was now gaunt with exhaustion. His blue eyes, once bright with the fervor of Nazi ideology, now held only fear and confusion. Klaus had been talking nervously for hours, as if his words could somehow hold back the terror that threatened to consume them all. Hans studied the boy's face in the dim light that filtered through the small barred window high above them. Klaus couldn't be more than 19, probably had never been away from his mother's kitchen table before the war swept him up and deposited him on a French battlefield. Now here he was, captured by the Americans after the disastrous retreat from Normandy, facing an unknown fate in an enemy land. "Somewhere in America," Hans replied quietly, his voice hoarse from thirst. "Beyond that, your guess is as good as mine." He had heard stories, terrible stories, about what the Americans did to German prisoners. The propaganda back home had filled their heads with images of barbaric torture, of prisoners forced to work in mines until they dropped dead, of systematic starvation and beatings designed to break the spirit of the master Buhr. Race. Sergeant Otto Kraus, a grizzled veteran from the Russian front, spat on the floor of the car. His weathered face bore scars from shrapnel, and his left hand was missing 2 fingers, lost to frostbite during the brutal winter campaign. "They'll work us to death in their factories," he growled, his Prussian accent thick with bitter certainty. "Mark my words, boys, they'll chain us like dogs and feed us scraps until we're too weak to stand. That's what happens to soldiers who surrender instead of dying with honor." The words sent a chill through the cramped car that had nothing to do with the October wind seeping through the gaps in the wooden walls. Hans had seen what happened to captured Americans on the Eastern Front. He had witnessed the systematic brutality of the SS, the casual cruelty that was considered normal procedure. If the Americans operated by the same rules, if they believed in the same philosophy of racial superiority in reverse, then they were all doomed men. Hans closed his eyes and tried to remember his home in the Bavarian countryside. His father's farm, with its rolling green hills dotted with dairy cows, seemed like a dream from another lifetime. He could almost smell his mother's apple strudel cooling on the kitchen windowsill, could almost hear his younger sister Greta practicing piano in the front parlor. Would he ever see them again? Would any of them survive whatever awaited at the end of this nightmare journey? The train began to slow, and Hans felt his heart pound against his ribs. Through the small window, he could see snow-covered fields stretching endlessly toward a gray horizon. Pine trees lined the tracks, their branches heavy with white powder that reminded him painfully of home. Somewhere in this frozen wilderness, American guards were preparing for their arrival. Somewhere ahead lay his fate. "Listen," Hans whispered to Klaus, and the others huddled nearby. Whatever happens, we stick together. We remember who we are, what we represent. We don't give them the satisfaction of seeing us break. His words sounded hollow even to his own ears. But they needed something to hold on to, some semblance of dignity in the face of the unknown. The brakes screamed against the wheels as the train finally ground to a halt. Heavy boots tramped along the length of the train, and Hans could hear the harsh voices of American soldiers shouting orders in English. The sound of that foreign language sent another wave of fear through the prisoners. Soon, very soon, the doors would open and their real ordeal would begin. A key rattled in the lock of their car door, and every man inside held his breath. The heavy wooden barrier slid open with a crash, and brilliant winter sunlight poured in, temporarily blinding them all. Hans squinted against the glare and saw the silhouettes of armed American soldiers standing in the snow. Their rifles were ready, their faces hidden beneath steel helmets. "Raus! Raus!" shouted one of the guards in broken German. "Out! Move it!" Hans struggled to his feet on legs that felt like water after 3 days of confinement. His knees buckled momentarily, but he forced himself upright and stepped toward the door. The cold air hit him like a physical blow, cutting through his torn uniform and setting his teeth chattering. Around him, his fellow prisoners stumbled out of the cattle car and formed a ragged line in the snow. The American guards were younger than Hans had expected, most of them looking barely older than Klaus. They wore heavy winter coats and warm boots, in stark contrast to the German prisoners shivering in their thin uniforms. One guard, a sergeant with kind eyes and a Chicago accent, was handing out wool blankets to the prisoners as they disembarked. "Here you go, Fritz," the sergeant said to Hans, draping a thick gray blanket over his shoulders. The gesture was so unexpected, so human, that Hans could only stare in confusion. This was not the savage brutality he had been promised. This was something else entirely. They were loaded onto army trucks for the final leg of their journey. Hans found himself pressed against Klaus and 2 other young soldiers, all of them wrapped in American blankets and trying to process what they had just experienced. The truck bounced along snowy roads that cut through dense forests of pine and oak. Occasionally, they passed farms with red barns and white farmhouses that looked remarkably similar to the ones Hans remembered from his childhood in Bavaria. "This doesn't look like a place of torture," Klaus whispered, his voice filled with confused hope. It looks like home." Hans nodded slowly, not trusting himself to speak. The landscape was indeed beautiful, peaceful even. Snow-laden branches created natural archways over the road, and in the distance, a church spire rose above a small town, its bells visible against the gray sky. This was not the industrial hellscape he had imagined, not the urban nightmare where prisoners would be worked to death in munitions factories. The truck turned through a gate marked with signs in English that Hans couldn't read, but he could see that this was clearly a military installation, with guard towers and fences topped with barbed wire. His brief moment of hope evaporated as reality reasserted itself. This was still a prison, regardless of how pastoral the surroundings might appear. The compound that greeted them was larger than Hans had expected, with dozens of wooden buildings arranged in neat rows like a small town. Smoke rose from chimneys, suggesting that at least some of the buildings were heated. American soldiers patrolled the perimeter, but they seemed relaxed, almost casual in their vigilance. There was none of the harsh military precision that Hans associated with German camps. They were herded into a large building that served as a processing center. Here, American officers sat behind wooden tables, interviewing each prisoner in turn. Hans watched as the men ahead of him answered questions about their names, ranks, and units. The Americans took notes, but seemed more interested in administrative details than in extracting military secrets through torture. When his turn came, Hans approached the table with his head held high, determined to maintain his dignity regardless of what followed. The American officer was a middle-aged man with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked more like a university professor than a military interrogator. "Name and rank?" the officer asked in heavily accented German. "Bauer, Hans. Corporal, 3rd Company, 24th Infantry Regiment," Hans replied, giving only the information required by the Geneva Convention. The officer made notes on a form and looked up at Hans with what appeared to be genuine curiosity rather than hostility. "You speak English, Corporal Bauer?" Hans hesitated, then nodded. "Some. I studied it in school." "Good. That will make things easier." The officer stamped Hans's form and handed it to a sergeant. "You'll be in Barracks 12. The sergeant will show you the way and explain the camp rules. Welcome to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin." "Welcome." The word echoed in Hans's mind as he followed the sergeant out of the processing building. When had he last been welcomed anywhere? Certainly not by his own officers, who had treated their men like expendable resources. Not by the French civilians who had watched German soldiers with hatred and fear. Not even by his fellow soldiers, who had viewed any show of kindness as weakness. Barracks 12 was a long, low building constructed of wood and tar paper. It reminded Hans of the temporary structures his unit had built during training exercises. Functional, but hardly comfortable. He steeled himself for the worst as the sergeant opened the door and gestured for him to enter. What he found inside defied every expectation he had formed during his long journey. The interior was warm, heated by two pot-bellied stoves that glowed red with burning coal. Rows of steel-framed beds lined both walls, each equipped with a mattress, sheets, blankets, and a pillow. Real beds, not the straw pallets or bare wooden platforms he had anticipated. Clean beds that looked more comfortable than anything he had slept on during his entire military service. "Your bunk is number 37, the sergeant explained, pointing to a bed halfway down the right wall. "Blankets are changed weekly, and there's a laundry building where you can wash your uniforms. Mess hall is in the building across the square. Breakfast at 0700, lunch at 1200, dinner at 1800. Any questions?" Hans could only shake his head, overwhelmed by the normalcy of it all. This was a far cry from the cages he had imagined, the concrete cells where prisoners were meant to sleep on the bare ground. This was civilized, almost comfortable. It was confusing and disturbing in ways that outright cruelty would never have been. As the sergeant left, Hans approached his assigned bunk and sat down on the edge of the mattress. The springs creaked softly under his weight, and he bounced slightly, testing the firmness. It was better than any bed he had ever slept in as a soldier, better even than his childhood bed back on the farm. He ran his hands over the clean white sheets, feeling their texture, their warmth. Other prisoners began filtering into the barracks, each man carrying his own bewilderment and confusion. Klaus appeared at the next bunk, his eyes wide as he stared at his own clean bedding. "Hans," he whispered, "what kind of game are they playing? Why are they treating us like this?" "I don't know," Hans replied honestly. He had been asking himself the same question ever since the American sergeant had handed him that wool blanket. Perhaps they're trying to soften us up before the real interrogation begins. Perhaps this is all part of some psychological warfare technique we haven't encountered before. But even as he said the words, Hans wasn't sure he believed them. There had been something in that processing officer's eyes, something in the way the guards had distributed blankets that suggested genuine human concern rather than calculated manipulation. It was a possibility that challenged everything Hans had been taught about the enemy, everything he thought he knew about the nature of war itself. That first night in the clean bed was the strangest experience of Hans's military career. After months of sleeping on muddy ground, in abandoned buildings, or in the back of trucks, the softness of the mattress felt almost alien against his body. He lay on his back, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to the quiet breathing of 47 other men who were grappling with the same confusion that plagued him. The barracks was warm, warmer than any German military facility he had ever occupied. The pot-bellied stoves radiated heat evenly throughout the long room, and Hans could feel his muscles relaxing for the first time in months. His uniform, still damp with sweat and grime from the journey, began to dry in the heated air. He pulled the thick wool blanket up to his chin and marveled at its softness. "Klaus," he whispered to the young private in the next bunk. "Are you awake?" "Yes," came the reply, barely audible in the darkness. "I can't stop thinking about home. This place, it reminds me of the youth hostel where my school stayed during our hiking trip in the Alps. Do you remember being comfortable like this?" Hans considered the question carefully. When had he last felt safe enough to truly rest? Not during the retreat from Normandy, certainly, when they had slipped in hedgerows and abandoned barns, while American artillery thundered in the distance. Not during the spring offensive, when exhaustion had been their constant companion. Not even during his training, when drill sergeants had made sure that comfort was always fleeting. "My mother's house," Hans said finally. "Christmas Eve, 1942, before they sent me to France." The memory came flooding back with unexpected clarity. The warmth of the kitchen where his family had gathered, the smell of roasted goose and cinnamon cookies, the sound of his sister's laughter as she opened her presents. It had been the last time he remembered feeling completely safe, completely at peace. "Do you think they're trying to make us forget who we are?" Klaus asked. "Make us soft, so we'll betray our country?" Hans turned onto his side, facing the younger man's bunk. Klaus's profile was barely visible in the dim light from the stoves, but Hans could see the worry lines etched across his boyish features. "I think," Hans said slowly, "that they're showing us something we weren't supposed to see, something that doesn't fit with what we were told about America." Across the barracks, Sergeant Krause's voice cut through the quiet murmur of conversation. "Don't let them fool you, boys," he growled. "This is all part of their plan. They want us weak, grateful. Tomorrow the real torture begins, mark my words." But Hans wasn't so sure. As he settled deeper into his clean bed, feeling his body relax into the comfortable mattress, he found himself remembering other things he had been told about the enemy that hadn't proven true. He had been told that Americans were cowards who would run at the first sign of real fighting, but he had seen them charge German machine gun nests with terrifying courage. He had been told that they were racially inferior, unable to match German military precision, but their equipment was superior and their tactics were devastatingly effective. What else had he been told that wasn't true? Sleep came gradually, settling over Hans like the warm blanket that covered his body. For the first time in months, he wasn't awakened by artillery fire or the screams of wounded men. No one shook him awake for a nighttime march or an emergency deployment. He simply slept, deeply and peacefully, until the morning sun streaming through the barracks windows brought him gently back to consciousness. The revelation of that first morning meal would prove even more disorienting than the comfortable bed. Hans had expected thin gruel and stale bread, the kind of subsistence rations that barely kept prisoners alive. Instead, he found himself standing in a mess hall that looked remarkably similar to the dining facilities he remembered from his brief stint at university before the war. Long wooden tables filled the room, each capable of seating 8 men. The floors were clean, mopped, and swept, and the windows let in cheerful morning sunlight that illuminated the space with an almost homey warmth. American soldiers served the food from behind a steam table, ladling generous portions onto metal trays that were handed to each prisoner in turn. Hans stared at his tray in bewilderment. Scrambled eggs, still steaming hot. Thick slices of bacon. Hash browns that were crispy on the outside and fluffy on the inside. 2 pieces of toast, with butter and jam. A cup of coffee that actually smelled like coffee, not the chicory substitute they had been drinking in the German army for the past 2 years. "This has to be a mistake," Klaus whispered as they found seats at one of the long tables. "They've given us officers' rations by accident." But as Hans looked around the mess hall, he could see that every prisoner was receiving the same generous portions. There was no hierarchy here, no separate meal for officers and enlisted men. Everyone ate the same food, and there was plenty of it. Hans had not seen this much food on a single plate since before the war began. He took a tentative bite of the scrambled eggs and closed his eyes in involuntary pleasure. They were perfectly cooked, seasoned with salt and pepper, and rich with butter. The bacon was crisp, but not burnt, salty and savory in a way that made his empty stomach growl with appreciation. The coffee was strong and hot, warming him from the inside out. "My God," breathed Klaus, his mouth full of hash browns. "I had forgotten that food could taste like this. In the army, everything tasted like cardboard and sadness." Around their table, other prisoners were having similar reactions. Men who had been hardened by years of war, who had learned to suppress emotion as a survival mechanism, were almost in tears over a simple breakfast. Hans watched as Sergeant Kraus ate his meal in sullen silence, clearly struggling to reconcile this bounty with his expectations of American brutality. A young American soldier, probably no older than Klaus, refilled their coffee cups as they ate. He smiled at Hans and said something in English that Hans didn't quite understand, but the tone was friendly, almost cheerful. This was not the behavior of a guard who viewed his charges as subhuman enemies. This was the behavior of someone who saw them simply as men who needed to be fed. After breakfast, they were assigned to work details. Hans had expected backbreaking labor, perhaps in a mine or a munitions factory, where German prisoners would be worked to death in service of the American war effort. Instead, he found himself assigned to the camp kitchen, helping to prepare meals for his fellow prisoners. The kitchen was clean and well organized, with modern equipment that was far superior to anything Hans had seen in German military facilities. The head cook was a cheerful Italian-American named Sergeant Di Marco, who spoke broken German and seemed genuinely pleased to have help with the enormous task of feeding over 1,000 prisoners 3 times a day. "You cooked before the war?" Di Marco asked Hans as he showed him how to operate the large potato peeling machine. "A little," Hans replied in English. "I helped my mother in the kitchen when I was young." Di Marco grinned and clapped Hans on the shoulder. "Good, good. We make you into proper cook. Maybe when war is over, you open restaurant, eh?" The casual assumption that Hans would survive the war, that he would have a future beyond this prison camp, was startling. Di Marco spoke, as if Hans's eventual return home was not just possible, but inevitable. In the German army, Hans had learned to think only of the present moment, to avoid making plans that extended beyond the next day or the next battle. The concept of a post-war future had become an impossible luxury. As the days turned into weeks, Hans began to settle into a routine that felt almost normal. He woke each morning in his clean bed, washed in facilities that were kept sanitary, and supplied with soap and hot water, ate meals that were both nutritious and satisfying, and spent his days working in the kitchen alongside American soldiers who treated him as a colleague rather than an enemy. The work was not difficult, certainly nothing compared to the brutal physical demands of infantry combat. Hans learned to prepare large quantities of food efficiently, to maintain the cleanliness standards that Sergeant Di Marco insisted upon, and to work as part of a team that included both American soldiers and German prisoners. The atmosphere in the kitchen was often jovial, with Di Marco telling jokes and stories while they worked, creating a sense of camaraderie that Hans had never experienced in the rigid hierarchy of the German military. In the evenings, after the dinner dishes were cleaned and stored, Hans would return to Barracks 12 for what had become his favorite part of each day. The time between dinner and light suit was unstructured, allowing the prisoners to read books from the camp library, write letters home, or simply talk among themselves. The conversations that took place during these evening hours would prove to be the most transformative aspect of Hans's imprisonment. Klaus had begun to change in subtle but noticeable ways. The fear that had dominated his expression during their transport to the camp had been replaced by a kind of cautious optimism. He had gained weight, his cheeks filling out from the regular meals, and his eyes had lost the haunted look that had marked him as a combat veteran despite his young age. "Hans," Klaus said one evening as they sat on their bunks, writing letters home, "do you think our families would believe us if we told them about this place?" Hans considered the question as he struggled to find words that would convey his experience to his mother without triggering the military censors who would read his letter before it was sent. How could he explain that his American captors were treating him with more kindness and respect than he had ever received from his own officers? How could he describe the comfortable beds, the abundant food, the dignified working conditions, without sounding like he had lost his mind or been brainwashed by enemy propaganda? "I don't think they would understand," Hans said finally. "I'm not sure I understand it myself. Everything we were taught about Americans, about how they would treat German prisoners, it's all been wrong." "Not just wrong," Klaus replied, lowering his voice to a whisper. "The opposite of the truth. They're treating us better than our own army ever did. Remember when it was like in training? The constant abuse, the deliberate humiliation, the way they told us it would make us strong? Hans remembered all too well. The German military philosophy was based on the idea that soldiers needed to be broken down and rebuilt in the image of the perfect Aryan warrior. Weakness was not tolerated, compassion was seen as a character flaw, and any show of humanity was beaten out of recruits through systematic brutality. He had accepted it as necessary, had even participated in it when he became a non-commissioned officer himself. But now, experiencing an entirely different approach to authority and discipline, Hans was beginning to question everything he had believed about strength and weakness. The American guards were clearly in control of the camp. Their authority was unquestioned, and yet they maintained order through respect rather than fear. The prisoners followed rules, not because they were terrified of punishment, but because the rules seemed reasonable and fairly applied. "Do you think," Klaus continued, "that we were the bad guys?" The question hung in the air between them like a physical presence. It was the thought that neither of them had dared to voice, the possibility that had been growing in their minds with each passing day of decent treatment. Hans felt something cold settle in his stomach as he contemplated the implications of Klaus's words. "I don't know," Hans whispered. "I don't know anything anymore." Across the barracks, other prisoners were engaged in similar conversations. The comfortable beds had given them the mental space to think clearly for the first time in months, and what they were thinking was deeply troubling to men who had defined themselves as soldiers of the Reich. Groups formed naturally, with younger soldiers like Klaus gravitating toward those who were willing to question what they had been taught, while older veterans like Sergeant Kraus maintained that this was all an elaborate deception designed to weaken their resolve. The division became more pronounced as winter settled over Wisconsin with full force. Snow piled up against the barracks windows, and the camp took on a cozy, almost festive atmosphere as Christmas approached. The American authorities allowed the prisoners to organize their own holiday celebrations, providing materials for decorations, and even arranging for a small Christmas tree to be set up in the mess hall. Hans found himself helping to organize a Christmas concert, drawing on his memories of the church choir he had belonged to as a boy. Other prisoners contributed their own talents, with musicians performing carols on instruments borrowed from the camp band, and artists creating decorations that transformed the utilitarian mess hall into something approaching a proper Christmas celebration. The night of the concert, Hans stood before his fellow prisoners and led them in singing Silent Night, the same carol he had sung with his family just 3 years earlier. But as his voice rose with the familiar melody, he was struck by the profound irony of the situation. Here he was, a German soldier imprisoned by the enemy, celebrating the birth of Christ in a spirit of peace and fellowship that had been entirely absent from his military service. The American guards attended the concert as invited guests, applauding enthusiastically and joining in when they recognized familiar melodies. Sergeant Di Marco even contributed a rendition of Ave Maria that brought tears to the eyes of hardened soldiers who had not cried since childhood. The boundaries between captor and captive seemed to dissolve in the warm light of the Christmas celebration. Later that evening, as Hans lay in his clean bed, reflecting on the concert, he realized that something fundamental had shifted inside him. The anger that had sustained him through years of war, the hatred that had been carefully cultivated by Nazi ideology, had somehow been replaced by something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't gratitude, exactly, though he was certainly grateful for the decent treatment he was receiving. It was something deeper, a recognition that the men who guarded him were fundamentally similar to himself and his fellow prisoners. "Klaus," he whispered to the bunk next to him. "Are you awake?" "Yes," came the reply. "I can't stop thinking about tonight, about how normal it felt, singing with the Americans in the audience, how right it felt." Hans nodded in the darkness. "I keep thinking about my sister, about how she would have loved tonight's concert. She plays piano, you know, and she has a beautiful voice. I think she would have gotten along well with Sergeant Di Marco." Do you think," Klaus asked hesitantly, "that Americans have families too? Sisters and mothers and people they miss?" It was such a simple question, but it struck Hans like a physical blow. Of course Americans had families. Of course they missed their loved ones and worried about their safety and dreamed of returning home when the war ended. He had known this intellectually, but he had never truly considered what it meant on an emotional level. The propaganda had been so effective at dehumanizing the enemy that Hans had somehow managed to fight for 3 years without ever truly acknowledging the humanity of the men he was trying to kill. "Yes," Hans said finally. "I think they do." The conversation continued in whispers until well past midnight, with both men grappling with realizations that challenged everything they had believed about the war, about their enemies, and about themselves. When sleep finally came, Hans's dreams were filled not with images of battle and death, but with memories of home and visions of a future where such conversations might be possible without the context of war. Spring arrived in Wisconsin with a sudden burst of warmth that melted the snow and filled the air with the scent of growing things. Hans had been in the camp for 6 months, and the routine had become so natural that he sometimes forgot he was a prisoner. He had gained weight, his health was better than it had been in years, and he had developed friendships with both fellow prisoners and American guards that he valued deeply. The work in the kitchen had expanded his responsibilities, and Sergeant Di Marco had begun teaching him advanced cooking techniques that went far beyond the simple food preparation he had learned at home. Hans discovered that he had a natural talent for creating flavors that pleased people, for understanding how different ingredients work together to create something greater than the sum of their parts. "You should consider culinary school when you get home," Di Marco told him one afternoon as they prepared dinner for the camp. "You have the touch, the understanding of food that can't be taught. You could make good living as chef." The suggestion planted a seed in Hans's mind that grew stronger with each passing day. Before the war, he had assumed he would take over his father's farm, had never seriously considered any other future for himself. But now, having discovered this unexpected talent and passion, he began to imagine a different kind of life. Perhaps Klaus had been right to ask whether Americans had families and dreams. Perhaps it was time for Hans to start dreaming again himself. The transformation was not limited to Hans alone. Throughout the camp, German prisoners were discovering aspects of themselves that the military had never encouraged them to explore. Men were writing poetry, creating artwork, learning new skills, and most importantly, learning to think for themselves rather than simply following orders. The comfortable beds had given them the physical rest they needed to heal from years of warfare, but the psychological healing was proving to be far more profound. Not everyone embraced this transformation willingly. Sergeant Kraus and a small group of die-hard Nazis maintained their rigid ideology despite the evidence of their own eyes. They interpreted every act of American kindness as a weakness to be exploited, every comfort as a trap designed to undermine their loyalty to the fatherland. They held secret meetings in which they reminded each other of their duty to escape and return to the fight, regardless of the consequences. Hans found himself increasingly isolated from this group, not because he disagreed with their dedication to Germany, but because he could no longer accept their definition of what loyalty to Germany should mean. The Germany he loved was the land of his childhood, the rolling hills and dairy farms of Bavaria, the Christmas markets and church bells and family gatherings that had shaped his early years. The Germany they defended was something else entirely, a political ideology built on hatred and conquest that bore no resemblance to the home he missed. The breaking point came in early summer, when news reached the camp of Germany's surrender. Hans was working in the kitchen when Sergeant Di Marco approached him with a somber expression and a radio in his hands. "Hans," Di Marco said gently, "I think you should hear this. It's over. Germany has surrendered." Hans listened in stunned silence as the announcer described the signing of the surrender documents in Berlin, the end of the Third Reich, and the beginning of the occupation of Germany by Allied forces. The war that had defined his entire adult life was over, and he was still alive. More than that, he was healthy and well-fed, and surrounded by people who had shown him nothing but kindness and respect. When he returned to the barracks that evening, Hans found the building in chaos. Some prisoners were celebrating the end of the war, relieved that the killing was finally over and they would eventually be allowed to return home. Others, led by Sergeant Kraus, were in a state of grief and rage, unable to accept that the 1,000-year Reich had lasted only 12 years. "This changes nothing," Kraus shouted at the assembled prisoners. "We are still German soldiers, still bound by our oath to the fatherland. The war may be over, but our duty continues. Klaus stood up from his bunk, his young face set with determination. What duty? He asked quietly. Our duty to what? The government that sent us to die in foreign fields for the glory of madmen? The officers who treated us like livestock? The ideology that taught us to hate people we had never met? Our duty to Koppel. Germany, Kraus replied furiously. To the sacred soil of our homeland, to the blood of our ancestors, to the future of our race. I love Germany too, Klaus said, his voice growing stronger. I love the Germany where my grandmother bakes bread every morning, and my grandfather tends his garden. I love the Germany of Christmas markets, and folk psalms, and village festivals. But the Germany was never served by this war. That Germany was betrayed by the men who started this war, not by the men who ended it. Hans felt a swell of pride as he watched Klaus stand up to the older sergeant. The frightened boy who had arrived at the camp 8 months earlier had grown into a young man with the courage to think for himself and speak his own truth. The clean bed had given him the rest he needed to heal, but more than that, it had given him the safety to discover who he really was beneath the uniform and the propaganda. Klaus is right, Hans said, standing up to support his friend. We have been shown a different way of living, a different way of treating people. We have been shown that strength doesn't require cruelty, that authority doesn't require brutality, that order doesn't require fear. Maybe it's time we stopped asking what Germany expects of us and started asking what we expect of Germany. The debate continued long into the night, with the barracks dividing into two clear factions. On one side were men like Kraus, who clung to the old ideology despite its obvious failures. On the other were men like Hans and Klaus, who had been changed by their experience of American hospitality, and were ready to embrace a different vision of what their country could become. The clean bed that Hans slept in that night felt different somehow, as if it had absorbed the weight of his transformation and reflected it back to him in the form of profound peace. For the first time since his capture, he was able to think clearly about what he wanted from his future, not just what was expected of him by others. He wanted to return to Germany, but not to resume his old life as a farmer's son who had never questioned authority or thought seriously about the world beyond his village. He wanted to return as someone who had learned valuable lessons about human dignity, and the possibility of building societies based on respect rather than fear. He wanted to take the techniques Sergeant Di Marco had taught him and use them to create something beautiful and nourishing for other people. Most of all, he wanted to remember this place, these people, and this experience for the rest of his life. He wanted to remember that enemies could become friends when they were treated with dignity, that opposing armies could find common ground in their shared humanity, and that the strongest nations were those that showed mercy to the defeated rather than grinding them into the dust. The process of repatriation began in the fall of 1945, with German prisoners being processed for return to their homeland in groups based on their military records and their behavior during captivity. Hans was among the first groups scheduled for release, having been classified as a model prisoner who posed no security risk to the United States. On his last morning at Camp McCoy, Hans woke in his clean bed for the final time and lay there for several minutes, trying to memorize the feeling of safety and comfort that had become so natural to him. The morning light streamed through the barracks windows, just as it had on that first day 8 months earlier. But everything else had changed completely. He was no longer the same man who had stumbled out of that cattle car, broken and terrified and filled with hatred for an enemy he had never truly understood. Klaus was already awake in the next bunk, staring at the ceiling with the same mixture of anticipation and sadness that Hans felt. They would be on the same transport ship back to Germany, but after that their paths would diverge. Klaus was returning to his family's farm in Stash, Bavaria, while Hans had decided to seek his fortune in one of the larger cities where he could pursue his newfound passion for cooking. "I'm going to miss this place," Klaus said quietly. "Is that wrong? To miss being a prisoner?" Hans shook his head. "I don't think we were prisoners here, not really. I think we were students, learning lessons we never could have learned anywhere else." They dressed in the civilian clothes that had been provided for their journey home, replacing the prison uniforms they had worn for so many months. Hans folded his uniform carefully and placed it in the bag that contained his few personal possessions. He would keep it as a reminder, not of his time as a German soldier, but of his time as a prisoner who had been treated with dignity by his enemies. Breakfast in the mess hall was a bittersweet affair, with groups of prisoners saying goodbye to American guards who had become friends and mentors. Sergeant Di Marco presented Hans with a handwritten collection of recipes, carefully translated into German, that would allow him to recreate some of the dishes he had learned to prepare. "You remember what I teach you, Di," Marco said, embracing Hans warmly. "You make people happy with good food. That's most important thing in life. Food brings people together, makes enemies into friends. You understand this now." Hans understood more than Di Marco probably realized. He understood that the act of feeding people was fundamentally an act of love, regardless of their nationality or political beliefs. He understood that the American soldiers who had served meals to German prisoners were demonstrating a kind of strength that was far more powerful than military might. They were showing that victory could be merciful. That power could be used to heal rather than to destroy. The transport to New York took 3 days by train, and Hans spent much of the journey staring out the windows at the American countryside rolling past. He saw farms that looked remarkably similar to those of his homeland, cities that bustled with the same energy he remembered from German towns before the war, and people who seemed to be living normal, peaceful lives while their country emerged victorious from the greatest conflict in human history. What struck him most was the absence of the triumphalism he might have expected from a conquering nation. The Americans, he observed, seemed more interested in returning to their peacetime pursuits than in celebrating their victory over Germany. There were no parades of conquered enemies, no public displays of German humiliation, no signs of the racial superiority complex that had driven Nazi ideology. The Americans simply seemed ready to move on with their lives. The ship that would carry them back to Europe was a converted troop transport, but it was clean and well-maintained, with decent food and adequate sleeping quarters. Hans found himself sharing a cabin with Klaus and 2 other former prisoners from their camp, men who had undergone similar transformations during their captivity. As the ship pulled away from New York Harbor, Hans stood at the rail and watched the American coastline fade into the distance. Somewhere behind those disappearing hills was a prison camp where he had learned more about himself and his values than in all his previous years combined. Somewhere in Wisconsin, a clean bed waited for the next group of prisoners who would need to discover their own humanity in the aftermath of war. The journey across the Atlantic took 8 days, and Hans used the time to write long letters to his family, trying to prepare them for the changes they would see in him. How could he explain that their son and brother had been transformed not by victory, but by defeat, not by conquest, but by compassion? How could he make them understand that he was returning home with profound gratitude for his enemies and deep skepticism about the cause for which he had fought? When the ship finally docked in Hamburg, Hans got his first glimpse of what defeat looked like from the German perspective. The city was a landscape of rubble and ruin, with entire neighborhoods reduced to piles of brick and twisted metal. Survivors picked their way through the debris like ghosts, their faces hollow with hunger and loss. This was the Germany that the 1,000-year Reich had created. For its people, a wasteland of destruction and despair. The contrast with the America he had just left could not have been more stark. While German cities lay in ruins, American cities hummed with prosperity and growth. While German civilians struggled to find enough food to survive, American prison camps had provided abundant meals to enemy soldiers. The lesson was unmistakable for anyone willing to see it. Hans made his way back to his family's farm in Bavaria by a series of trains and trucks, each leg of the journey revealing more evidence of Germany's devastation. But when he finally walked up the familiar dirt road to his childhood home, he found that his family's farm had survived the war largely intact. His parents and sister rushed out to greet him, their faces bright with joy and relief. "Hans!" his mother cried, throwing her arms around him. "We thought you were dead. We hadn't heard from you in so long. And then the surrender, and we didn't know what had happened to prisoners of war." His father stood back, studying Hans's face with the careful eye of a man who had seen his own share of war a generation earlier. "You look well," he said finally. "Better than I expected for someone who has been in an enemy prison camp." Hans embraced his family and allowed them to lead him into the familiar warmth of his childhood home. But as he sat at the kitchen table where he had eaten so many meals as a boy, he found himself comparing his mother's simple fare to the abundant meals he had enjoyed at Camp McCoy. The irony was not lost on him that he had eaten better as a prisoner in America than he had as a free citizen of Germany. Over the following days, Hans told his family about his experiences in carefully measured doses, watching their faces for signs of disbelief or disapproval. His sister Greta was fascinated by his stories of American kindness and seemed eager to believe that their former enemies were capable of mercy. His parents were more skeptical, having lived through the propaganda campaigns that had portrayed Americans as savage barbarians bent on destroying German civilization. "You must understand," his father said one evening as they sat before the fire, "that we were told terrible things about what would happen to German prisoners. We were told that you would be worked to death in slave labor camps, that you would be tortured and starved and treated worse than animals. When your letters started coming from America, talking about comfortable beds and good food, we thought the censors were forcing you to write lies." Hans nodded, understanding his father's confusion. "I thought the same thing at first. I kept waiting for the real brutality to begin, for the Americans to show their true nature. It took me months to accept that what I was experiencing was genuine kindness rather than raw psychological warfare." "But why?" Greta asked. "Why would they treat German soldiers well when we were their enemies, when our armies had conquered their allies and bombed their cities?" It was the question Hans had been asking himself for months, and he still didn't have a complete answer. "I think," he said slowly, "that they were showing us what they were fighting for. Not just the defeat of Germany, but the victory of a different way of treating people. They were demonstrating that their strength came from their values, not just from their weapons." His father frowned. "That sounds like propaganda, Hans. No nation treats its enemies well out of pure kindness. There must have been some strategic purpose, some advantage they gained from keeping you comfortable." Hans considered this objection carefully. It was true that America had gained certain advantages from treating German prisoners humanely. They had avoided the costs and complexities of managing a hostile prisoner population. They had gathered valuable intelligence through cooperation rather than coercion. And they had created a pool of potential allies for the post-war reconstruction of Germany. But Hans had seen something in the eyes of his American guards that went beyond strategic calculation. He had seen genuine human concern, real empathy for men who were far from home and afraid for their futures. Sergeant Di Marco had not taught him to cook because it served American interests. He had done it because he enjoyed sharing his knowledge and skills with someone who appreciated them. "Perhaps you're right that there were strategic benefits," Hans said to his father. "But I don't think that explains everything I experienced. I think there were Americans who treated us well simply because they believed it was the right thing to do, regardless of any advantage it might give them." The conversation continued late into the night, with Hans trying to convey not just the facts of his imprisonment, but the emotional and spiritual transformation it had created. His family listened with a mixture of fascination and concern, clearly worried that their son and brother had been somehow brainwashed by enemy propaganda. They had expected him to return filled with hatred for his captors and eager to resume the fight against Germany's enemies. Instead, they found a man who spoke of his former enemies with respect and gratitude. Over the following weeks, Hans began to explore the possibility of leaving the farm to pursue his culinary ambitions. The recipes that Sergeant Di Marco had given him were a treasure trove of techniques and flavors that were largely unknown in post-war Germany. With food still scarce and restaurants barely beginning to reopen, there might be opportunities for someone with his newfound skills. He traveled to Munich, where he found a city struggling to rebuild itself from the rubble of Allied bombing. But amid the destruction, there were signs of renewal and hope. American occupation forces were working with German civilians to restore essential services, and there was talk of massive reconstruction programs that would help Germany rebuild as a democratic nation. Hans found work in a small restaurant that was attempting to serve both German customers and American occupation personnel. His skills in the kitchen quickly made him valuable to the owner, but more importantly, his ability to communicate with American soldiers and his understanding of their food preferences made him a bridge between the two communities. It was in this restaurant that Hans had his most profound realization about the meaning of his prison camp experience. As he prepared meals for German civilians and American soldiers sitting at neighboring tables, he understood that food really could be a force for healing and reconciliation. The act of sharing a meal, of breaking bread together, created bonds that transcended national boundaries and political differences. One evening, a group of American officers came to the restaurant for dinner, and Hans recognized one of them as Lieutenant Morrison, a guard who had worked at Camp McCoy during his imprisonment. The lieutenant recognized Hans as well and came back to the kitchen to greet him warmly. "Hans, I can't believe it's you," Morrison said, shaking his hand vigorously. "Di Marco told me you were planning to become a chef, but I never imagined I'd find you cooking in Munich. How are you adjusting to being back home?" Hans smiled, feeling a deep warmth at this unexpected reunion. "It's been an adjustment," he admitted. "Germany is very different from what I left behind, but I'm grateful for the skills I learned at your camp. They've given me a new purpose, a new way of thinking about my future." Morrison nodded, his expression serious. "You know, we learned a lot from you prisoners, too. Working at that camp changed my understanding of war, of what it means to defeat an enemy without destroying their humanity. I think a lot of us went home different people because of that experience." The conversation continued for several minutes, with both men acknowledging the profound impact that their unlikely friendship had created. When Morrison finally returned to his table, Hans stood in the kitchen for a long moment, overwhelmed by the realization that the transformation he had experienced was not unique to him alone. The clean bed at Camp McCoy had been more than just a place to sleep. It had been a symbol of a different approach to human relationships, a demonstration that even in wartime, even between enemies, it was possible to maintain dignity and respect. The Americans who had provided those beds, who had served abundant meals and treated their prisoners as human beings rather than animals, had planted seeds that would continue to grow long after the last prisoner had been repatriated. Years passed, and Hans built a successful career as a chef and restaurant owner. He married a young woman from his hometown, started a family, and became a pillar of his community. But he never forgot the lessons he had learned in that Wisconsin prison camp, and he never stopped talking about the importance of treating all people, even one's enemies, with dignity and respect. He would often tell his children and grandchildren about the clean bed that had changed his life, about the American sergeant who had taught him to cook, about the moment when he realized that his enemies were also human beings with families and dreams and hopes for the future. He told them these stories not to glorify war or imprisonment, but to illustrate the power of mercy and the strength that comes from choosing compassion over cruelty. In his restaurant, Hans made a point of serving anyone who came through his doors, regardless of their nationality or political beliefs. American tourists, French businessmen, British diplomats, and former German soldiers all found themselves sitting at the same tables, sharing meals prepared with equal care and attention. Food became Hans's way of continuing the work that had begun in that prison camp, the work of building bridges between former enemies and creating understanding where once there had been only hatred. The clean bed at Camp McCoy became a legend in Hans's family, a story passed down through generations, as an example of how small acts of kindness can transform lives and change the course of history. His grandson, who became a diplomat, would often credit his grandfather's prison camp stories with inspiring his own career dedicated to international cooperation and conflict resolution. Klaus, who had remained Hans's lifelong friend, took a different path, but carried similar lessons from their shared experience. He became a teacher, dedicating his life to educating young Germans about the dangers of blind nationalism and the importance of critical thinking. In his classroom, he would often talk about the clean bed at Camp McCoy as a symbol of what civilized nations could accomplish when they chose to treat even their enemies with humanity. The two men would meet annually on the anniversary of their arrival at the camp, sharing a meal and reminiscing about the transformative experience that had shaped the rest of their lives. They would talk about Sergeant Di Marco and Lieutenant Morrison, about the other prisoners who had shared their barracks, about the American guards who had shown them a different way of thinking about strength and power. As they grew older, Hans and Klaus became living reminders of an important truth that many people preferred to forget, that wars end, but the lessons learned from them can last for generations. The clean bed that had seemed like such a small thing, just a comfortable place to sleep after months of hardship, had actually been a profound statement about human dignity and the possibility of redemption even in the darkest circumstances. Hans lived to be 87 years old, passing away peacefully in his sleep surrounded by his family. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched, including several American veterans who had made the journey to Germany to pay their respects to a former enemy who had become a friend. They brought with them a small American flag and a letter from the descendants of Sergeant Di Marco, acknowledging Hans's role in demonstrating that former enemies could indeed become lasting friends. In his final years, Hans had often reflected on the strange trajectory of his life, how a young Nazi soldier filled with hatred and propaganda had been transformed by the simple act of being treated with dignity by his captors. The clean bed at Camp McCoy had given him more than just physical rest. It had given him the mental and emotional space needed to rediscover his own humanity and to recognize the humanity in others. The lessons of that prison camp experience extended far beyond Hans's individual transformation. They became part of a larger story about the post-war reconstruction of Germany and the relationship between America and its former enemies. The decision to treat German prisoners humanely was part of a broader strategy of winning the peace, as well as the war, of creating the conditions for a lasting reconciliation rather than a temporary ceasefire. The clean beds at Camp MCAI and hundreds of other American prison camps became symbols of a different approach to victory, one that emphasized reconstruction rather than revenge, rehabilitation rather than retribution. The German prisoners who experienced this treatment returned home with stories that challenged the Nazi narrative about American barbarism and helped to create the foundation for the democratic transformation of Germany. Hans's story was not unique, but it was representative of a larger phenomenon that helped to shape the post-war world. Thousands of German prisoners returned home from American camps, with similar experiences of decent treatment and unexpected kindness. They became ambassadors for a different vision of what international relationships could look like, advocates for democracy and human rights, who had learned their lessons not through propaganda, but through personal experience. The clean bed that had seemed like such a small gesture, providing comfort to an enemy soldier far from home, had actually been part of a revolutionary approach to warfare and its aftermath. It represented the idea that even in the midst of conflict, it was possible to maintain one's moral principles and to treat defeated enemies in ways that created the possibility for future friendship rather than, lasting enmity. In the end, Hans's experience at Camp McCoy became a testament to the power of human dignity to transform hearts and minds, even under the most unlikely circumstances. The clean bed, where he had slept peacefully while his country lay in ruins, became a symbol of hope that transcended national boundaries and political differences. It proved that even in the darkest chapters of human history, there were always individuals and institutions committed to preserving and protecting the basic dignity that all people deserve. The story of Hans Bauer and his clean bed in a Wisconsin prison camp would be remembered long after the last veterans of the Second World War had passed away, serving as a reminder that true strength lies not in the ability to defeat one's enemies, but in the wisdom to transform them into friends through acts of mercy, kindness, and respect for human dignity. But the full impact of Hans's transformation would not be understood until many years later, when historians began to study the broader implications of America's prisoner of war policies during the Second World War. What they discovered was that the decision to treat German prisoners humanely was not just a matter of military necessity or strategic advantage, but part of a deliberate philosophy that would ultimately reshape them all. Entire post-war world. The man most responsible for this philosophy was General George Marshall, who had insisted from the beginning of America's involvement in the war that prisoner treatment should reflect American values rather than mirror enemy practices. Marshall understood that how America treated its prisoners would send a message not just to the German government, but to the German people about what kind of nation America truly was. The clean beds at camps like MC Coy were therefore not accidents or afterthoughts, but deliberate statements about American character. Hans would not learn about General Marshall's role until decades later, when he was invited to speak in a conference on prisoner of war experiences at the University of Wisconsin. By then, an elderly man with white hair and a gentle manner that belied his wartime experiences, Hans found himself standing before an audience of historians, veterans, and students, trying to explain how a simple bed had changed the course of his entire life. "You must understand," Hans told the audience, speaking in heavily accented but fluent English, "that I arrived at Camp Messy expecting to die. Not quickly, in battle, but slowly, through deliberate cruelty designed to break my spirit before it broke my body. This was what I had been taught to expect from America, what our propaganda had told us would be our fate if we were captured." He paused, looking out at the faces in the auditorium, many of them young people who had been born long after the war ended. "Instead, I found myself in a place that challenged everything I thought I knew about strength, about power, about what it means to be victorious. The Americans who ran that camp showed me that true strength lies not in the ability to inflict suffering on your enemies, but in the wisdom to treat them with dignity, even when they have not earned it." After his presentation, Hans was approached by Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a historian who was writing a book about the long-term effects of prisoner treatment policies. She had been researching the stories of former German POWs for several years, trying to understand how their experiences in American camps had influenced their post-war lives and careers. "Your story is remarkable," Dr. Chen told him as they sat in the university cafeteria, sharing coffee and discussing his experiences. "But what I find most interesting is how representative it seems to be. I've interviewed over 200 former German prisoners, and the vast majority tell similar stories of transformation. They arrived expecting brutality and found humanity instead." Hans nodded, stirring sugar into his coffee with deliberate care. "I stayed in touch with many of the men who were at MC Coy with me. Klaus, of course, but others as well. We would write letters, visit each other when possible, share stories about how our lives had developed. Almost all of us found that the experience had changed us in fundamental ways." "Can you give me some examples?" Dr. Chen asked, her pen poised over her notebook. Hans thought for a moment, remembering the faces and names of men he had not seen for years, but had never forgotten. There was Friedrich Weber, a sergeant from Prussia who had been one of the most dedicated Nazis in our group when we arrived. He was older than most of us, had been a party member since the early 30s, truly believed in the superiority of the German race. But by the time we were repatriated, he had completely changed his views. Hans paused to sip his coffee, remembering Friedrich's transformation with crystal clarity. Friedrich went back to Germany and became a social worker, dedicating his life to helping refugees and displaced persons rebuild their lives. He told me years later that watching American guards treat German prisoners with kindness had shown him what real strength looked like. He said it was the first time he had seen authority exercised without cruelty, power used to help rather than to harm. Dr. Chen made notes as Hans spoke, fascinated by the ripple effects of decisions made by American military planners decades earlier. "What about the others? Did they all have similar experiences?" "Not all, but most," Hans replied. "There was Werner Hoffmann, who became a Lutheran minister and spent his career preaching about reconciliation and forgiveness. There was Gustav Richter, Klaus's cousin, who became a journalist and wrote extensively about the importance of international cooperation. There was Ernst Müller, who emigrated to America after the war and became a citizen, eventually serving in the Korean conflict as an American soldier." Each name brought back a flood of memories from those long winter evenings in Barracks 12, when men who had been trained to kill without question found themselves questioning everything they had been taught about the nature of warfare and national loyalty. The conversations that had taken place in that heated building, warmed by American coal, and illuminated by electric lights powered by American generators, had planted seeds that would continue to grow for decades. Dr. Chen was particularly interested in the psychological mechanisms that had enabled such profound transformations. From a scholarly perspective, she said, "What you're describing is remarkable. These were not men who were predisposed to change their fundamental beliefs. They were soldiers, trained to follow orders and maintain loyalty to their cause. Yet something about their treatment at American POW camps seems to have created the conditions for dramatic personal transformation." Hans considered her words carefully. He had thought about this question many times over the years, trying to understand exactly what had happened to him and his fellow prisoners during those months in Wisconsin. "I think," he said slowly, "that it was the unexpectedness of it all. We arrived prepared for the worst, armed with hatred and determination to resist whatever torture awaited us. But instead of torture, we found kindness. Instead of cruelty, we found respect. It was so completely different from what we expected that it forced us to reconsider everything we believed." He leaned forward in his chair, his eyes brightening as he warmed to the subject. "You see, the Nazi ideology depended on the idea that other races, other nations, were fundamentally inferior to Germans. We were taught that Americans were weak, soft, unable to make the hard decisions necessary for true greatness. But at Camp Missisquoi, we saw something that contradicted this completely. We saw Americans making what seemed to us like the hardest decision of all, the decision to treat their enemies with humanity, even when those enemies had shown no such consideration." Dr. Chen nodded, understanding the profound cognitive dissonance that such treatment must have created. "So the kindness you experienced wasn't just personally meaningful, it was ideologically challenging. It forced you to question fundamental assumptions about American character and capabilities." "Exactly," Hans said. "And once you begin questioning one fundamental assumption, it becomes easier to question others. If Americans were not the weak, degenerate people we had been told they were, then what else had we been told that was untrue? If treating enemies with dignity was a sign of strength rather than weakness, then what did that say about the German approach to conquered peoples?" The conversation continued for over an hour, with Hans sharing memories and insights that he had never articulated so clearly before. Dr. Chen's questions pushed him to think more deeply about his craft, experiences, to analyze, rather than simply remember the transformative months at Camp McCoy. As they prepared to part ways, Dr. Chen asked one final question that would stay with Hans for the rest of his life. "If you could go back and speak to the American officials who made the decision to treat German prisoners humanely, what would you say to them?" Hans was quiet for a long moment, considering the weight of the question. "I would thank them," he said finally. "Not just for saving my life, though they certainly did that. I would thank them for saving my soul. For showing me that it was possible to be strong without being cruel, to be victorious without being vengeful. For giving me the chance to become a better man than I was when the war began." After Dr. Chen left, Hans remained in the cafeteria for another hour, lost in memories of those distant days when he had been a young soldier facing an uncertain future in a foreign land. The university students around him reminded him of Klaus at 19, eager and uncertain, trying to understand their place in a complex world. He wondered what lessons they would learn from their own experiences. What clean beds and unexpected kindnesses would shape their understanding of human nature. The more Hans reflected on his prisoner of war experience, the more he came to understand that it had been part of something much larger than individual transformation. The American decision to treat German prisoners humanely had been an investment in the future, a bet that mercy could accomplish what revenge never could. It had been a demonstration of American values that was far more powerful than any propaganda campaign. This realization became even clearer to Hans during the Burr 1960s, when he had the opportunity to travel to America as part of a cultural exchange program designed to strengthen German-American relations. He visited several former POW camps, including Camp McCoy, which had been converted into a training facility for American troops. Walking through the grounds where Barracks 12 had once stood, Hans felt a profound sense of gratitude and loss. The buildings were gone, replaced by modern structures that bore no resemblance to the wooden barracks where he had slept on clean sheets and dreamed of a different kind of future. but the memory of what had happened there remained as vivid as ever. He was accompanied on this visit by Colonel James Patterson, who had been a young lieutenant at Camp McCoy during Hans's imprisonment. Patterson, now a career military officer, had requested the opportunity to meet with former prisoners as part of his own effort to understand the long-term effects of American POW policies. "You know," Patterson told Hans as they stood where the mess hall had once been, "we were all so young then, barely older than the prisoners we were guarding. Most of us had no idea that what we were doing would have such lasting impact. We were just following orders, trying to do our jobs as best we could." Hans nodded, understanding the modesty that often characterized American descriptions of their wartime achievements. "Perhaps that was part of what made it so effective," he suggested. "The fact that your kindness was natural, not calculated. We could sense that you were treating us well not because you had been ordered to, but because you believed it was the right thing to do." Patterson smiled at this observation. "I suppose you're right. We were raised to believe in treating people decently, regardless of the circumstances. It never occurred to most of us to do otherwise, even when dealing with enemy prisoners." This casual acceptance of basic human decency as a natural response, even in wartime, struck Hans as perhaps the most remarkable aspect of American character. In the German military, kindness had been seen as weakness, something to be suppressed in favor of hardness and brutality. The idea that treating people well could be a source of strength rather than vulnerability had been completely foreign to his pre-war understanding. During his visit to America, Hans also had the opportunity to meet with Sergeant Di Marco, who was now retired and living in Chicago with his large Italian-American family. Di Marco, now in his 70s, but still energetic and cheerful, welcomed Hans into his home like a long-lost son, insisting that he stay for dinner and meet the entire extended family. "You see this?" Di Marco said, gesturing around his crowded kitchen where 3 generations of family members were preparing a feast in Hans's honor. "This is what we were fighting for. Not just to defeat Germany, but to preserve this. The ability to live in peace with our families, to welcome strangers into our homes, to treat all people like human beings regardless of where they come from." The dinner that followed was a revelation for Hans, who found himself at the center of a warm, chaotic celebration that reminded him of his own family gatherings in Bavaria. Di Marco's children and grandchildren peppered him with questions about Germany, about his experiences during the war, about his life as a chef and restaurant owner. They treated him not as a former enemy, but as an honored guest whose presence enriched their family celebration. As the evening progressed and wine flowed freely, the conversation turned to more serious topics. Di Marco's oldest son, who had served in Vietnam, wanted to understand how his father's generation had managed to transform former enemies into friends so successfully. "It wasn't magic," Di Marco explained, refilling Hans's wine glass with the care he had once shown in portioning meals at Camp McCoy. "It was just about treating people like people. When you feed someone, when you give them a clean place to sleep, when you show them respect even when they're your prisoner, you're telling them something about who you are. And maybe, if you're lucky, they start to believe that they can be that kind of person too." Hans raised his glass in a toast. "To clean beds and good food," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "To second chances and new beginnings. To the possibility that former enemies can become lifelong friends." The toast was echoed around the table by voices speaking in English and broken German, by people who represented the best hopes of the post-war world. The dream that understanding could triumph over hatred and that mercy could prove more powerful than vengeance. Later that evening, as Hans walked through the streets of Chicago with Di Marco, he marveled at the vibrant, peaceful city that surrounded them. This was what American strength had built, not through conquest and domination, but through the patient work of treating people decently and creating the conditions for prosperity and growth. "You know," Hans said as they paused to look at the lights reflecting on Lake Michigan, "I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Germany had chosen your approach instead of the path we actually took. If we had built our strength on the foundation of human dignity rather than racial superiority." Di Marco nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe we never would have had to fight a war at all. Maybe we could have been allies from the beginning. working together to build a better world instead of tearing each other apart. It was a poignant thought, the idea that the terrible suffering of the Second World War might have been avoided if more nations had understood the connection between strength and mercy, between power and responsibility. But Hans also recognized that such speculation was ultimately less important than the lessons that could be learned from what had actually happened. The clean bed at Camp McCoy had been more than just a symbol of American kindness. It had been a practical demonstration of an alternative approach to international relations. It had shown that nations could choose to break cycles of revenge and retaliation, that victory could be used as an opportunity to build bridges rather than walls. This lesson would prove increasingly relevant as Hans aged and watched new conflicts emerge around the world. During the Cold War, he saw both sides sometimes forget the importance of treating adversaries with dignity, allowing ideological differences to justify increasingly harsh measures. During various regional conflicts, he witnessed the same patterns of dehumanization and brutality that had characterized his own youth as a Nazi soldier. But he also saw examples of leaders and nations that remembered the lessons of the Second World War, that chose reconciliation over revenge, and understood that lasting peace could only be built on foundations of mutual respect. The European Union, which eventually brought together former enemies in a partnership based on shared values rather than military dominance, seemed to Hans like a fulfillment of the promise that had been implicit in that clean bed at Camp McCoy. In his final years, Hans often spoke to young people about his experiences, trying to convey the importance of choosing mercy over vengeance and understanding over hatred. He would tell them about the night he had first slept in a clean bed as an American prisoner, about the moment when he realized that his captors saw him as a human being rather than an animal, about the gradual transformation that had changed him from a hate-filled soldier into a man committed to building bridges between former enemies. The bed itself was not magic, he would tell his audiences. It was just a mattress and some clean sheets. But what it represented, the values it embodied, the message it sent about human dignity and the possibility of redemption, that was truly transformative. It showed me that even in the darkest moments of human history, there are always people who choose kindness over cruelty, who believe in the possibility of change and growth." End quote. Hans passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 89, surrounded by his children and grandchildren in the same Bavarian farmhouse where he had been born. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched, including several elderly Americans who had made the journey to Germany to pay their respects to a man who had embodied the best possibilities of German-American friendship. Among the mourners was Dr. Elizabeth Chen, who had completed her book about POW experiences and dedicated it to Hans and the other former prisoners who had shared their stories with her. The book, titled Clean Beds and Second Chances: How America's Treatment of German POWs Changed the Post-War World, became a bestseller and helped to educate a new generation about the importance of treating all people with dignity, even in times of conflict. In the years following Hans's death, his story continued to inspire people around the world who were working to build peace and understanding between former enemies. The clean bed at Camp McCoy became a powerful metaphor for the idea that small acts of kindness could have profound historical consequences, that individual choices to treat others with dignity could ultimately reshape the relationships between entire nations. The Hans Bauer Foundation, established by his children to promote international understanding and reconciliation, funded exchange programs that brought together young people from countries that had been at war with each other. These programs, modeled on the cultural exchange that had brought Hans back to America in the 1960s, created opportunities for new generations to discover their common humanity across lines of nationality and ideology. The foundation's motto, inscribed on a plaque at its headquarters in Munich, captured the essence of Hans's transformation and the broader lessons of his experience. From clean beds to clean slates, the power of human dignity to transform enemies into friends. It served as a reminder that the choice between revenge and reconciliation, between cruelty and kindness, remains available to every generation, and that the decisions made in moments of victory can determine whether peace will last or whether new conflicts will emerge to perpetuate cycles of hatred and violence. The story of Hans Bauer and his clean bed in a Wisconsin prison camp thus became more than just one man's account of personal transformation. It became a testament to the power of moral courage, a demonstration that nations and individuals can choose to break cycles of revenge and retaliation, and a reminder that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy one's enemies, but in the wisdom to transform them into friends through acts of mercy, dignity, and respect for the fundamental humanity that all people share.